In Mark 16, the 15th chapter, Jesus gives some instructions that weren't just given to his disciples. They were given to us. And it says that we are to go throughout the whole world and share the gospel, the good news of Christ. Does anyone have a word for the Lord? Now, these are words that are spoken in many Pentecostal churches that I have been in my days across our country. They're not only spoken, but sometimes they're shouted, kind of like this. Does anybody have a word for the Lord? And sure enough, someone will stand up and come to the front of the sanctuary, and they will give a testimony or a witness of what God has done in their life. Each of us needs to be ready to testify for God when we're called on to do it. And it's something that we don't talk about much in this church. However, last Wednesday night we were talking about journeys. And we had some beautiful testimonies given about God being with people from our church who were on journeys. Well, today I'm going to testify to you about the journey God has taken me on, not the whole 33 years in the ministry, but a part of it. I'd like to begin with how I ended up at Zion United Church of Christ. It was in the fall of the year 2004. And Lynn and I had pretty much decided that Zion United Church of Christ was going to be our home church. We enjoyed the music, and we enjoyed Pastor Eli, and Pastor Roy, who we had no idea who he was, came to the pulpit one Sunday, and I remember leaning over to Lynn and saying, "Doesn't it look like he just belongs in that pulpit?" He had a wonderful message that day as well. Now, I had taught as a guest teacher, Foods of the Bible, Plants and Flowers of the Bible, and the welcome that my family and I received from Zion was beyond anything I had ever gotten anywhere else. It was greeting time, just like we had greeting time this morning. And Lynn and I were seated about where the chutes are this morning, and Pastor Eli made his way down there during the greeting time, and he leaned over to Lynn and I and said, "Something is going to happen in the service today that might change your life." What could that be? I had no idea, and Lynn and I just looked at one another with eyes wide open. As the service went on, Pastor Eli, from behind the pulpit, pulled up a dozen red roses. He walked over to the lectern and announced that Gay Santoro, who was our associate pastor at the time, had resigned and she would be moving on. Well, that was the news, but how did it fit my life? How was it to change my life? Well, it was to change my life in this way. In the coming weeks, I met with Pastor Eli, members of the consistory, and they asked me if I would fill in for him while he was on a 3-month sabbatical leave. And this is when he went to Yellowstone. And that would be the next year during the summer months. Now, 3 months has turned into 8 years. And Roy and I were talking this morning. He was to be here 3 months and 13 years now, Roy? Roy's been here 13 years. You're setting a pattern. Well, let me talk a little bit about my journey of how I got involved with the United Church of Christ. It was 1956 when my parents decided that they would join a very progressive church in our community. A church that was open to everyone, who served the entire community. It was the very hub of the community. And in that church, they had things like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. The building was open for them to use. There were youth choirs and youth groups and wonderful camps for young people to attend, and there were retreats as well, and those things were right up my alley, and so I enjoyed growing up at the Austintown community. Back then in '56, it was the Evangelical and Reformed Church. Now, a second thing happened besides my family getting involved in the United Church of Christ way back then. It was in the spring of 1968. This is one of the important parts of my journey with God. It was 1968, and I was in the halls of Austintown Fitch High School going to a mixed choir class. And I looked up 4 steps, and there were glass doors, and the morning sunlight was beaming in there. And it might as well have been an angel standing in that doorway, because there was Linda Myers, as she was known back then. I knew in that moment that that was the person who would be my wife and share the rest of my life with me. We went to the prom together and the after prom together. Graduation came, and we were the last class to graduate from the old Austintown Fitch High School building. And we went in every classroom that was unlocked, and we scrolled across the blackboard, Linda Myers and Gary Smith forever, and drew a big heart around it. 44 years later, yeah, I know isn't forever, but we're getting close. We were married a year later, and in 1972 we had our first child, Amy, and in February of 1975, God was going to change my life. Now, Lynn's best thing that she does is have children, and unfortunately she's beyond that point in her life, but she loved having children. And she was pregnant in 1975 in the spring with our first son, and I always say she looked like she was 12 months pregnant. She was that big. She was the secretary of our congregation for our congregational meetings at the Austintown Community Church. She took the minutes. We didn't get any lunch at the carry-in dinner because we ate too late. We got in line too late. And here I was to come to Akron that day, and Lynn was coming with me to a church growth seminar for the United Church of Christ. And it was at the Miller Avenue Church. Now, Amy and I went to calling hours for one of our members here in the church this week up in Akron. And I noticed that the Miller Avenue Church is still there. And if you're heading west on 76, you'll see that the church is backed right up against the highway. I'm sure the highway must have taken part of their property because it's an older building. But here we are. We're going to this church growth seminar. Now, at the time, I was a deacon in the church. I was working for the Youngstown Sheet Tube Company. I had my little card that said I was a licensed millwright and could repair whatever you would put in front of me. And we had been married in that church. Our 4 children were to be baptized there, each one as they were born. And I thought life was good. I thought my life was complete. It looked like everybody had children, good job at that time. And I thought God had really blessed us. But oh, that night, the third person who spoke that night at the church growth seminar, his name was Leonard Evans. And he delivered a life-changing message from the Lord. And if he didn't deliver it to anyone else, he delivered it to me. This is a clipboard seminar now. Not come down front and pray or anything like that. Just listening to what had happened. Leonard Evans was a retired Navy chaplain. And he served the Pleasant Valley Evangelical Church in Niles, Ohio. And when he came to the church, there were 200 members in that particular church, and 3 years later, there were 2,000 people that attended the morning service and the evening service at Pleasant Valley Church. There were priests that came to the evening service. There were nuns. There were ministers from practically every church in the area who flocked to that particular worship to see what it was that caused that church to grow. Now, as Leonard Evans told us at the Church Growth Seminar, we asked, well, what is it? What is it that has made your church grow? Now, Len Evans was short, very round. He always had a smile on his face, and he was forever cheerful. And he told us that it was by the love of Jesus Christ that his church had grown. And he said, you know, the gospel of Jesus Christ, that he died on the cross for you while you were yet a sinner. I sat there and I thought, somebody died for me? I was hearing the gospel in its entirety for the very first time. Now, not that I hadn't heard the gospel preached before, but I was hearing the gospel preached for the very first time. I went home that night. Didn't say a word to Len about any of it. I went in next to my bed and I knelt down and I said, Lord, I don't know what you would want Gary Smith for, but I'm going to give myself to you tonight. You can do whatever you will with me. The clock moved ahead to 1979, and the steel mills had always supported the area of Youngstown and Struthers and Niles and those Girard and all those little towns around there. And people earned a great living and had wonderful benefits working for those companies, but in 1979 they went belly up. But God was good to Lynn and I during those years. The mill where I worked brought in a team from New York City, and they helped us be tested and figured out whether we needed to go to college or what kind of training we needed to have. I took the test. Here's what I found out. I was tested and I scored highest in helping others, giving care to other people. Well, one of the jobs I looked into was that of an insurance salesman. And I scored high on that test too, but I'm sure glad that I didn't take the job. I'd always enjoyed working around the church I'd grown up in, so that was a priority, and I was collecting unemployment, and I thought the church could use a leg up right now. We had an educational building that was built in 1968, I think, and it had never been painted inside, so I decided that that would be a good job for me. And as I was working in the classrooms one day, painting, I heard a very familiar voice yell up through the window, and it was Helen Swinehart. Pastor Swinehart had been our minister for 42 years at the Austintown Community Church. I knew her voice well. She was very stern as she said, Gary Smith, come to the parsonage for lunch today with the pastor and I. Not another word. I was to be there. Now that sounded good to me because I knew what to expect. Helen's homemade vegetable soup, and everything in that soup was grown in the garden behind the parsonage. It was delicious. Oh, that is, except the beef that she would use in the soup. We had a great time visiting, and the pastor, of course, excused himself to go on hospital calls, but Mrs. Swinehart said, stay put. I need to talk to you. And immediately my mind raced back to the 4th grade. Why the 4th grade? Because in the 4th grade, I was an acolyte to light the candles for the worship service. My parents, I don't know why they weren't watching me get ready for church, but I put on a black suit with a pair of white socks. And Mrs. Swinehart grabbed me after the service and scolded me big time for not having on dark socks with my black suit. Well, it was that same tone that she started out talking to me there at the table. She opened a bottle of Coke, and she split it with me. And she said, I have to have Coke at lunchtime because being a pastor's wife is a very busy job. So we shared that bottle of Coke together. And she said these words to me. She said, Gary, now you know Pastor Swinehart is getting old. He doesn't have the energy nor the time to work with the young people in our church. She said, even though you've just been a lay person teaching a Sunday school class, I've watched you work with the children, and I like what I see. May I propose to consistory that you be hired as our new Christian education director in the month of September. I hadn't had a day of college, no formal training other than some partners in ministry classes through the United Church of Christ. Me? Me as the Christian education director at the Austintown Community Church? Well, as Helen asked, so went the church back in those days. She took her proposal to consistory and I was hired. I did begin my years of training in a higher education setting and was called to the ministry during those years, and I was ordained in the United Church of Christ there in Austintown. Enough history. Roy read some scriptures that have always meant a lot to me from Romans 8, and I hope they meant a lot to you. He was very eloquent in the way that he read those this morning, and they were very meaningful. We can't truly believe those words that Roy read this morning unless we have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. We can't believe that death or life or angels or principalities, nakedness or famine or anything to come or anything from the past can separate us from the love of God which is ours in Christ Jesus unless we have that relationship with Jesus Christ, that same relationship that I made mine on that February night in 1975. Jesus gave us a new commandment, and it wipes out all the other commandments. In John 13:34, Jesus says, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you. And then he told us in Matthew 5:13 that we were the salt of the earth. We are the agents of Christ's love in a corrupt world. We're those tiny granules. When you mix salt in something that you're cooking, it usually enhances the flavor, and we are to be that enhancing agent in God's church with His love. You think a church can grow from 200 to 2,000? I believe it can, but only by way of the love of Jesus Christ. If every committee operates out of the love of Jesus Christ, if every class in this church teaches the love of Jesus Christ, if every staff member, and every member for that matter, practices the love of Jesus Christ, we can grow and we can flourish. Over the holidays, the pastor of the downtown Cleveland Stone Church was interviewed by Leon Bibb from Channel 5. And when asked by the reporter what was lacking in the church today, the pastor said this: Churches have become too much like corporations. They lack what God gave them in the beginning to make them different, better, and even unique. And what is that? What do they lack? Leon Bibb asked, "Preacher?" He looked and smiled and said, "Simple. It is setting aside all the rules and the ways of the world and operating out of the love of Jesus Christ." Can you imagine filling every seat in this sanctuary? The balconies, the one to our south and the one to our west, and having to turn these Sunday school chairs around in the chapel area and opening the curtains wide open because there are so many people here to hear the gospel proclaimed. I can imagine that. Can you imagine sending offering plates up from the back and seeing them so full that money was falling off onto the floor, and the pastor standing up with a smile on his face and saying, "By the way, if you need help today, take it from the plate as it goes by." It can happen. It can truly happen. If we share the love of Jesus Christ, people can be changed. Even church people can be changed. Maybe this is a day that you'd like to be changed. We're going to take just a few minutes this morning to pray for those who want that change in their life. We're going to ask you to step forward so that we can pray for you. Those who have prayer needs, health needs, financial needs, we're going to ask that you come forward, and we want to anoint you with oil, and we want to pray for those needs in your lives as we sing the closing.